Buenos dias. This is another in a series of slideshow presentations about ancient history. This one, as you can plainly see, is the first involving Egypt, cleverly entitled the Old Kingdom. We, we will also talk about the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, though not right now. Egypt is traditionally known in many different textbooks and sources as, quote, the gift of the Nile. This is a bit trite, but a not inaccurate description of the importance of the Nile to Egypt itself. As you can see, the entire extent of ancient Egyptian civilization is right along the Nile. Slightly a few miles in either direction, it is dry desert and therefore very few people live there. It is also the gift of the Nile because, as we have discussed, rivers make ancient civilizations possible through irrigation, drinking water, travel, trade, and of course, the annual flooding. Egypt, though, has a crucial difference in the style and type of its flooding. The priests or scribes of ancient Egypt, the learned class, built nilometers, a column on which they could mark, measure, and predict the annual rise of the Nile. Here is one that is still in existence today in Cairo. This is important because the Nile rose and flooded predictably and regularly. What this meant was every year you could track the rising flood waters and you could predict when they would crest and how tall they would be. This nice, reliable, predictable flooding allowed a different type of culture and civilization to flourish in ancient Egypt. Much like neighboring Mesopotamia, around about 3200 BCE, writing emerged in Egypt. The most well-known is known as hieroglyphics and is shown here in the picture. It is a pictograph or a picture form of writing. It never evolved into an alphabet in the way that, say, cuneiform did. It was the language of the upper classes. The rules for their gods and religion, their laws, their proclamations would all be carved and written and proclaimed in hieroglyphics, which incidentally we could not translate until only about 200 years ago. There was another type of written language known as Demotic. It was more of a script form or an alphabet. It was not as pictorial or as elaborate. It was more sort of for everyday transactions, for letters, for journals, for keeping accounts in your small business, for example. So, hieroglyphics, formal, higher class, demotic, informal, middle or lower class language. Everyday language was in Demotic. The Old Kingdom emerges around about, as you can see here, 2280. It is also occasionally dated from 2686 to 2160 BCE. There are some debates about the exact dates because the farther back in time you go, the scantier documentation. But know that it emerges in the 2000s and is over by the end of the 2000s BCE. Crucially, it spreads up the Nile and its extent of rule and law stops at the first cataract or the first waterfall. Importantly, and I'll go back a couple of slides for this, Lower Egypt is in the north. Upper Egypt is farther south. Here again is the first cataract or waterfall. Why that is, and this is going to sound confusing, so bear with me, is that the Nile flows from south to the north. Okay? Unlike most rivers, it flows from the south in the middle part of Africa north to the Mediterranean. So going up the Nile leads you to Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt is at the end of the Nile. This is because all rivers flow towards the largest body of water. It just so happens in Egypt that the largest body of water is to the north. So again, Lower Egypt is in the north, Upper Egypt is in the south because the Nile flows from south to north. The key concept and the most important figure in the Old Kingdom is Ma'at and the Pharaoh. This is a later drawing of the goddess Ma'at from the Middle or New Kingdom. A lot of the terms continue from Old Kingdom to Middle and New, but some of the stories and concepts change. But I wanted a pretty picture for you. In the Old Kingdom, Ma'at means order, justice, harmony, or balance. It was the responsibility of the Pharaoh to maintain Ma'at, to make sure that the things, that their world, that their society was properly ordered, properly balanced, and that things proceeded according to their same plan. The Egyptians really valued predictability and stability almost above all else, in part accounting for their nice predictable flooding, and the two probably have some relationship. The pharaoh is viewed as basically a god. Unlike in other cultures that we have learned about or are going to, he's not a representative of the gods. He's not sort of standing in on their behalf. He is himself a god. He is in the line of the gods, and therefore he is viewed as some higher, some in fact divine power. This accounts for, in the Old Kingdom, the emergence of monumental tombs to house the bodies of the pharaohs. This is the first of them, and it is known as the step pyramid because it goes up in pretty little steps. It will become a pattern of monumental tomb building, and this shows us two important things. One, the value placed on the pharaoh. All of this labor, and here are people, so it gives you an idea of how large it is. All this labor, time, and effort is being expended to bury the body of one person. It also indicates the value they placed on the afterlife. They believed in a peaceful, happy, prosperous afterlife that you could achieve through living a good and an ordered life. As we saw in the story of Gilgamesh, ancient Mesopotamia had a very different view of what the afterlife was probably like. And the fact that Egypt had a long period of peaceful reign and predictable flooding, and gods who could seemingly be logical may account for the difference in their attitudes to what happened after death. Of course, the most famous tombs are the pyramids at Giza, three of them shown here. It took about 21,000 people working 10 hours a day, 300 days a year for 14 years just to build the largest one here, the Pyramid of Khufu or Cheops. The importance of the afterlife and of the position of the pharaoh can be seen in the story of Isis and Osiris. This is Isis, the goddess of magic, and the sister and wife of Osiris. And this story again hints at the importance for the Egypts of purity in their ruling classes and the fact that it was not altogether uncommon for brothers and sisters to marry each other and rule as king and queen to maintain the pure bloodline. This story as well indicates the importance placed on the afterlife, on the proper preservation of the body in terms of people now call them mummies, right? It also indicates the importance of this process of death and rebirth. The body of Osiris is cut, chopped up into many pieces, spread across Egypt, and then it is put back together and is reborn, just as the Nile floods spreads across Egypt every year to bring renewal and rebirth. We can also talk about the emergence and the importance to ancient Egypt, as most other ancient civilizations, of social classes. Here at the bottom are the unskilled workers, also the slaves, right? People who don't really have a status or position in society. They are not coincidentally the largest group. Above them are herders, agricultural workers, and farmers. Above them, traders, artisans or craftspeople and shopkeepers, above them the priests, the army commanders, the noble ruling class, and at the top of the pyramid, obviously, the king or pharaoh and his family. This is the growth in population. The emergence of ancient Egypt around about 4000 BCE of 350,000 people to the beginning of the Old Kingdom in 2500 BCE with 1 million people to the peak in the Middle Kingdom in 1500 BCE of 5 million people. This indicates a steady growth in population, a nice, stable, plentiful, bountiful harvest each year, and the growth of agriculture tying to the population. Egypt was a great place to live in peace and harmony if you knew your place and status in the pyramid. It also had a lot fewer cool inventions, and that may go hand in hand as well. Lastly, the importance of trade and connections. Egypt and Mesopotamia are part of the general Fertile Crescent, and they are closely linked, and these areas in yellow indicate towns and cities of people living and allowing them to trade with each other. From Egypt come important new goods, wheat and agricultural goods, as well as paper, which comes from the ancient Egyptian reed papyrus. Also gold. They have plentiful gold down here from Africa that travels down the Nile to the upper and then lower kingdom and can travel outward to Mesopotamia, where they have good inventions: the wheel, pottery, bronze metal, and bronze weaponry. And these two things are linked through trade and travel, as well as to the Indus Valley and the ancient Greek areas as well. All of these Bronze Age civilizations are linked through trade and travel. We will talk more about that in the weeks to come. Thank you and goodbye.